Hey you guys, I'm here today back with Rob Landis at Good Life Nutrition, and we are going to be talking about salt. We've talked a lot about supplements, but we're going to talk about salt and just the different types of salt. Rob has a ton of information for us, so let's just kind of dive into salt and the different types, because when I was growing up, it was just you had a salt shaker on your table, and that was the same salt that we used to bake with and everything,
right.
you know?
Yes, you and me both. We all knew
Right.
about Morton's, a little girl carrying it that was
Yes.
dumping it behind her with her umbrella.
Yes.
Right. So salt is the only rock that people eat commonly.
Okay.
And this is what salt looks like when it's mined. Obviously,
Very
it's not
cool.
sea salt. Yeah. So, and all salt is from the sea, Jill.
Okay.
Either a real old sea or one right now.
Okay.
And it's something that we need. People, salt's kind of got a bad name. Just like fat did in the 80s, salt kind of
Yes.
is now. It's like, oh, I got to watch my salt because this is going to happen. But we need salt.
So someone that's like, is watching their sodium doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be low on salt.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little
Okay.
bit. There's actually been some research with that. So, and let me just get my reference here. But
Yeah.
when we look at a salt study back in 2014, people who took between 2,600 and 4,900 milligrams a day, there was no adverse outcomes with that
Of
intake of salt.
Okay.
So of health conditions. Now you've heard of people being on 1,200 milligrams a day or less. What the research does show is that when you're very, very high, and I don't really know what excessive is as far as how they term that in research, but we know that below 1,200, there's actually some health issues with that.
Okay.
When we're in that sweet spot, which is pretty wide, there's no adverse outcomes, there's no increased mortality in the studies, that risk of death,
Okay.
when you're getting salt intakes in that level.
Okay. All right.
Big thing that we find that's really interesting is that potassium intakes are kind of low in comparison to salt intakes because we don't eat raw foods, we don't eat whole foods as much, and a lot of our salt comes out,
Gotcha.
processed
Okay.
foods.
Product comes from yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. All right. So tell us about these different salts here.
Okay.
You've got.
So we had the example of mined salt. So the Morton salt that we ate as kids, that's mined, but it's also processed. So they take that out, they mine it, and then they basically turn it into solution, wash it, get all the other trace minerals out. And so all it is sodium chloride, salt.
Okay.
And then they add in anti-caking agents, usually silica, which is not dangerous, but it's just sodium chloride.
Okay.
Now, when we get a salt like, I know you've used the Himalayan salt.
Yes,
This is mined. That is from Pakistan.
Yes.
So some people have some issues with that, like what's the quality control there? It is pretty good. And the pink color that you see in Himalayan, that's from the increase in iron content. Just a little bit of iron in there, kind of coloring that.
Got it.
So this is one type
Okay.
of mined salt, and then another kind. That's like a more of an earthy flavor for some people. I like it. Do you like
Yeah,
it?
I
know
like
you
it.
use it. And then the real salt is mined in Utah. That's what this is, and you can notice the different colors. And
Oh, that's cool how
yeah,
it's-
and it is 98%. Both of these are 98% sodium chloride and 2% trace minerals. So there's calcium, magnesium, sulfur, manganese, different trace minerals like that.
Okay.
Whereas, like we talked about, the Morton's is only sodium chloride.
Right.
So that's one reason why some doctors will have you use a sea salt or a mined salt. And we'll talk a little bit here about sea salt in a second.
Okay.
But this has a sweeter flavor to me. It's really unique that you could have a
Yeah, you don't
different
even
flavor
think
in
that.
salt, but there is.
You definitely notice a difference, like kosher salt versus, regular table salt versus sea salt.
Yeah, these are definitely going to have different flavor profiles. And then, so these are the mined salts. And then we talk about like a sea salt. The most popular is called Celtic or Celtic sea salt, and this is mined in France.
Okay.
And so it's seawater that goes into these clay pools, and then they evaporate it. And this is only about 80, let me make sure on my notes here, I'm sorry, I should
that's
know
all right.
this. About 85% salt, 2% trace minerals, and the rest is moisture.
Ah.
So this is one that a lot of doctors recommend.
Okay.
And it's probably the one for people who are having health issues, would probably be the most assimilable, meaning they can get all those nutrients a little bit more easily.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this is like a finely ground one, which
That's
is
right.
kind of nice because, like, when you're baking, a lot of times the quote good salt that you see is either it's in a grinder like this or it's more coarse. And I like a fine salt when if you're baking and you're sifting, so that might be a good one for that.
And you can get it in different consistencies and sizes too.
Yeah.
So the Celtic comes in larger crystals
Right.
as well. Now the interesting thing, I know a doctor around here that uses the Celtic sea salt or Celtic sea salt with people who've had adrenal fatigue. So
Okay.
is this something that you talk about a little bit with some of your
Yeah,
clients?
well, in the Faster Way, we definitely talked about adrenal fatigue.
So
I mean, you all are familiar with that.
are you wondering why maybe if you've had some adrenal issues over long periods of time, you might crave more salt? So long periods of time of adrenal issues decreases your production of cortisol, and the body starts to use the hormones to make more cortisol because you're low in it.
Yes.
And it stops making as much aldosterone, which is the hormone in your kidneys that controls how much sodium you retain.
Oh, interesting.
So this is why if your clients are experiencing a lot of thirst and desire for salt, they may have some issues with their adrenal glands because they're dumping more sodium in their diet. And so they might need to supplement with salt at that point in time.
Wow, that's really interesting.
It's fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, I had no idea.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Okay, so what about iodine? Talk
Yeah,
about
so the salt that we used as kids,
Yes.
Morrison's, has iodine added. Everything that you and I have just talked about doesn't have iodine.
that. Okay.
So there's food sources for that, right?
Okay.
And so the most common that we would think about are seafoods, sea fish, shrimp, crustaceans, all that from the
Right.
sea.
Right.
Seaweed,
Okay. I know.
sushi, anybody?
It's always, yeah, I love sushi. Yes.
But kelp is a natural
Okay.
way to get that. Bladderwrack, which is that stuff when you go to the beach you see washed up, it's actually
Yes.
a supplement. It's rich in iodine as well.
Okay.
And iodine can get deficient, and it's very important, as you know, for thyroid function.
Right.
So if you're not using any iodized salt and you might be predisposed to thyroid issues, it's probably wise to either supplement with it or make sure you're getting it in your food sources.
That's really interesting. I'm already have somebody in mind. I'm going to talk to
Yeah.
you about that. Okay, so food that is like low sodium or low salt. What's your take on that?
Well, like we were talking about earlier, that 2014 American Journal of Hypertension is that between 2,600 and 4,900 milligrams a day, the quote was associated with favorable health outcomes.
Okay.
Rob, are you saying that salt is healthy?
Yeah.
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 I am, Jill.
Okay.
No, not excessively. And we got to remember, we're talking about not salt that's found in processed foods, because I know that Faster Way ladies and men
Yes.
aren't eating tons of that.
Right.
Why? Because it's so loaded with sodium.
That's
that-
on the extreme side.
Oh, it's easy to go over. I don't know
Yeah.
what, I should have a can of soup here in front of us and we could look and see what a serving has. So, obviously, I'm not giving medical advice. If your doctor says go on a low sodium diet, you need to follow that advice.
Right.
But the research shows that salt can be healthy, Jill.
Okay.
And like we talked about earlier, consider potassium. Potassium has been shown to help decrease the risk of stroke and cardiovascular events. Why? Because it helps to lower blood pressure.
And just tell us ways to get potassium.
Yeah. Well, one that I know a lot of people like is avocados. And we hear about bananas a lot, which bananas do have some potassium, but green leafies have a lot of potassium in there. And we just talked about the avocados, potatoes, squash, sweet potatoes. Those are all great sources of
Okay.
potassium.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's like really good news. I'm trying to think, is there anything else we need to discuss with salt? Which one of these is your favorite?
Okay, for taste, my taste is I like the sweeter kind of fun taste of the real salt mine in Utah. But if somebody was asking me, Rob, what do you think is the healthiest salt? I would probably use the Celtic.
Okay.
And then, what do I use the most is the Himalayan. So there's a three-part answer. But
Yeah.
honestly, this is my favorite taste, and this is probably what would be used if you had some issues and you wanted to get adequate amounts of sodium that's really healthy and has trace minerals in it.
Okay, very good. Awesome. Well, that was a lot of information. You guys have questions, put them in the comments below. All these products you can get at Rob's store if you're local. Come over here in Marion. He's across the parking lot from Rural King. So, awesome.
Thanks, Jill. Appreciate it. Bye, everybody.